Okay, so what I'm going to do in this video, this is part of, well, this is a process part of a bigger build, and there'll be a link to that build video somewhere. But what I'm doing is I'm making some feet for some cabinets that I'm making, and I've decided I'm going to use an offcut of what is going to end up being the top of the cabinet. It's a piece of live edge 1 3/4 or 7/4 oak. And what I want to do is surface it both sides so that I've got a nice glue surface area. This is still the rough sawn area. So what I'm going to do is use my router with a jig to level this surface. Then I'm going to flip it over and surface that one as well. So if you haven't got a planer or a thicknesser, this is a great method of using a router with a quick jig to get the same job done. It's a little bit messier, admittedly. I have got a thicknessing machine, but I haven't got it here. It's not worth the aggro of going and getting it and all the rest of it. So I'm going to show you how I use my router, and I'll show you the jig as well. So I'm just using a 1/4 inch router. I'm not using a big heavy duty router for this, and to be honest, normally when I do surfacing, because you're taking off only just a small amount, if you've only got a 1/4 inch router, it does work fine. Maybe just take a bit longer on enormous boards. So I've got a guide bush fitted to this. This is an 1 1/4 inch guide bush, but that's not really relevant. If you've got a guide bush that's of a suitable size, you can make the jig up to suit that. In fact, you don't even specifically need a guide bush. The cutter's the important bit. You can use a normal 2-flute straight cutter. This is a 2-flute straight cutter that I use for just rough levelling. It's one that's got a bottom third cutting edge in the centre. It cuts nicely, and it's a cheap way of doing it. What you have to watch out for is you sometimes get shadow lines at the edge of the cut where the cutter is. So I prefer to use this kind of cutter. It's a 3-flute, and hopefully you can see on there that rather than having a square corner as a standard 2-flute has, this has got a chamfered edge, or sometimes they've got a rounded edge so that it smooths out and you don't get those shadow lines. It's 3-flute. It just means you get 50% more cuts rather than 2 cuts. You get 3 for every revolution of the cutter. The jig itself is really, really simple. This is a piece of corium, but you can use plywood or MDF or anything that's flat, or just a plexiglass, perspex, acrylic, whatever you've got. I like to use 1/2 inch or at least 9mm, particularly for the larger ones, because you don't get the sag effect between the feet. I've put 2 blocks, one here and there's one at the other end. They're fixed on there permanently, and what I do on the bottom of that, dependent on the thickness of the material I'm doing, if I need it higher or lower, I have got removable pads so I can jack it up a little bit extra. These have already been thicknessed, the main blocks, and then what I like to use is MDF. So I've got these ones here which are 12mm MDF, and then I've got these ones which is 6mm MDF. As long as it's flat and a consistent thickness, that's all you need. I've routed out an aperture here where the cutter can go through, and then I've put these 2 pieces on here essentially to act as stiffeners to stop this piece from sagging, because obviously it's suspended on its feet, so that helps stop this board from sagging, but it also acts as a guide to, hopefully, as it did there, stop you cutting into the jig itself. But if you do, it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. This is a really, really, really simple jig. In fact, for small ones you don't even need these pieces. That's the reason for the guide bush on mine. It stops the cutter from doing that. Okay, so I've got my piece of board on a flat surface. It doesn't have to be a downdraft table, it could be another piece of MDF, another piece of ply. As long as it's flat and stable, that's really all that matters. Obviously the flatter and more stable, the better the surface quality, because effectively you're referencing off this on your jig to be flat and parallel. What I've gone ahead and done is use just some hot melt glue. This piece of wood was rocking on these two corners, so I put a dab of hot melt glue under this corner and this corner, let it cool, and then, as you can hopefully see down there, just a weld line of hot glue from there to there along this side, and then on the other, just to keep it from moving around. Next job is to double check that my jig will clear the board, which it does by as small amount as you can possibly get away with, because that just means you've got more plunge on your router. So the jig's not going to fall off on this side, it's not going to fall off on this side. I should get full coverage on there. Next thing I need to do with my router, plunge the machine down until it's just above or touching in places. So I set my depth. I'm just going to take a small amount off here, and that'll show me where the high points are as to how much I need to remove on subsequent passes. Okay, so that's started taking off these high points here, and actually it's very, very smooth, and you can barely see any shadow lines. To really get rid of those shadow lines totally, if this was going to be a tabletop or something like that you want a really good surface on, because actually it's quite difficult to sand those marks out or even scrape them out, go much slower. I was going fairly quick across there, but as you can see we're starting to move, and I've actually got a bit there and a bit there I've taken off. So I'll probably take just a hair more plunge to start deepening down here. The way I adjust the plunge, if you've got a fine height adjuster you can just dial it down, but I'm using just the normal plunge bar, and actually I haven't plunged all the way down on that, so just double check that is referencing off the base. Okay, so that's now zeroed out on that, hopefully. Let's plunge right down. Still got a little bit of clearance. I can see by looking under here that the router's plunged down. So what I'm going to do is set my depth stop to 0 and then bring it up by just a hair, tighten it back down, plunge all the way to that. Hopefully now you'll be able to see that is hitting on the timber. And again I can look under here just to see how much it's cutting. So my surface is all nice and flat now. I can get a wide chisel under here. There we go. Just peel that off. That's why I like to use like a weld line down the corners rather than blobs. So a bit of hot glue. Just leave that there for that to cool. So this was the first side I did, and hopefully you can see that there are some slight witness marks where I cut across the grain. Now if you're doing a big plank, like a huge slab of log, generally you don't have any option but to go across the grain. So that's the sort of thing that you can expect. Now on the second cut I went with the grain, and hopefully you can see there aren't any of those shadow lines on there at all. Now it doesn't matter on this piece because these are just going to be some feet, but where you've got the option to go along the grain, you generally get a better result. It could well be the way the grain cuts, but also if you do get any witness lines, then they tend to be hidden by the grain and much more easily camouflaged. So my recommendation is where possible go with the grain, but obviously if you're cutting a big long slab, unless you're going to make your jig that long, you might have to go across the grain. But both ways works, as proved. Now you've got a nice consistent thickness. Square these up and I can make my feet. Hopefully that was informative, gave you a few ideas of how you can use a router, save yourself a few £100, dollars or currency without the need of an expensive thicknesser, and also it's safer for smaller pieces and much more practical for bigger pieces. You just scale up or down your jig to your need. I'm going to use this to make the feet for some cabinets I'm making. If you want to see that build video, there'll be a link somewhere in the description, yada yada. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out our weekly podcast that I run with Chris Cute from Make the First Cut, Alan Robinson, the Woodworking Junkie, Joe Whittaker from Average Joe's Joinery, and also Jamie Page over at JP Woodworks. A lot of fun, amusing, and hopefully some ideas and food for thought. So links to all those things in the description. We'll see you next time.